Good evening, everyone, and thank you for your patience and joining us this evening for what should be an excellent webinar with the Right Honourable Sir John Hayes MP, and hosted, of course, by the Roger Scruton Centre. So as you just heard, my name is Sarah Kaczynski, and I'm currently a Policy Fellow at Pinsker Centre. The Roger Scruton Centre for the Study of Western Civilization is an organisation which ensures that the ideas and works of the late Sir Roger are preserved and promoted. The centre is dedicated to furthering the understanding around Western civilization and the unique value of this shared inheritance. By working with universities, public institutions, government and think tanks, the centre seeks to strengthen defenders of the West and its allies and improve public knowledge for both the benefit of leaders and citizens. The legacy of Sir Roger also continues through the work of his family at Scrutopia, which hosts an excellent summer school at the Scruton's beautiful manor farm. I must, of course, thank partners for the event this evening. So thanks go to Blue Beyond, Newcastle University Conservative Society, Essex University Conservative Society, and Reading University Conservative Association. Your support is very much appreciated. So our distinguished speaker tonight is Sir John Hayes. Sir John has been MP for Holland and South Holland and Deepings in Lincolnshire since 1997. He has held various ministerial and shadow ministerial positions as part of a parliamentary career that has spanned almost a quarter of a century. His ministerial portfolios have included Minister of State for Further Education, Minister of State for Energy, Minister of State for Security, and Minister of State for Transport. He is also a member of the Privy Council and currently sits on the Intelligence and Security Committee. He has spoken regularly about the importance of basing conservative policy around philosophy, and recently has stressed the importance of lockdown changes not becoming embedded into society. This evening, Sir John will be speaking on the topic of the character of conservatism and addressing the future direction that conservatism may take. And chairing the event this evening will be Charlie Woods, who is Programme Director at the Roger Scruton Centre. So thank you all again, and I hope you very much enjoy the event.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been so patient. I can finally, and I'm really delighted to introduce Sir John Hayes MP. Sir John will be making some preparatory remarks, and then we will launch straight into the Q&A.
Thank you so much, and thank you for waiting. I as you said, I had a white knuckle journey back from Westminster, where I was earlier today, because I'm having to get home to address this important gathering. And I hope, of course, what you described in my opening remarks, to stimulate to a kind of thinking which has too infrequently been the narrative of the Conservative Party for all the time I've been in it. So let me start with this assertion that liberalism is the problem, not the solution. But in the desire to find an alternative to socialism in post-war Britain, the mantra that was adopted, essentially around freedom and individual interest, whilst it may have been useful in providing exactly that bulwark against statist socialism, obscured conservatism's both meaning and purpose. Conservatism, in essence, is this. And if you remember nothing else of what I say tonight, I hope you might treasure this part of it. Conservatism is the belief that the collective wisdom of ages, vested in institutions, both great like the Crown, and humble like what Burke called the little platoons, ultimately the family being the most significant of those platoons, in that vested in those institutions, it is bound to be more important than the fads and fashions, the preoccupations and predilections of any one generation at any point in time. And our duty is to take the inheritance of that collective wisdom and pass it on to those who will follow us intact and hopefully with a difference that we've made to it marginally, which is positive. So if we squander that inheritance or fail to look to those born later, we're not only betraying them, we're betraying ourselves. We're not doing our social duty. And it's in that connection to all that's been, all will come, conservatism finds its essence. It is, by definition, therefore, a deeply humble idea, because we know that the best we can do is to mitigate the inevitable imperfections of the human condition. It is a generous idea in that we respect what came before us and owe something to those that will come later than us. So it is both humble and generous. And it's a modest idea, because we know that, as I described it, the difference we can make is only likely to be marginal. So it is modest and humble and generous. And yet conservatism is painted, because we've allowed ourselves to be characterized around by liberalism, is painted as something that is none of those things. That's selfish and harsh and cruel. And that's because if you invest in the liberal mindset, you inevitably place individual interest above all else. And individual interest is, as you will have gathered from what I've already said, entirely at odds with that generosity, moderation, and humility, which is the Tory way. The problem we have, and I'm going to end on this note, I'm going to end with a problem, a challenge, and an opportunity. The problem we have, that the case for the kind of conservatism that I've described has so rarely been made. That's in part because it is at its very core a sentiment. Michael Oakeshott, the conservative philosopher, who of course famously lectured at the London School of Economics, said that conservatism was a disposition, not an ideology. I think he was wrong, actually. I said earlier in conversation that Michael Oakeshott's a much cleverer man than I'll ever be, but I think he was wrong. I think it's a sentiment. And sentiments are, of course, very hard to articulate and almost impossible to codify. And for that reason, they can't be reduced to the mantra of political discourse. The way we engage in politics often through exchanging a series of mantra. And so that's the problem. It's been articulated so rarely that people neither know what I might describe as the conservative scripture nor the conservative liturgy. They don't have the intellectual substance to justify a cohesive and coherent argument, something that sticks together and is whole. And they don't have the liturgy, the series of what I described a moment ago as mantra, to be able to market that, to brand it and sell it. The challenge is that unless we do so, we will lose the argument. And sadly, I fear that's what's happened in my lifetime and continues to happen. Perhaps at a pace now that we've never seen before, by the way. People think of the post-war period I described as when socialism was at apex, you have Cold War, growth of communism in China, Maoism, combination of Marxism, Maoism, and Stalinism as being the most challenging period in our history. I kind of think that whilst there's a good argument for that you could make an equally plausible argument, and perhaps in my judgment a better one, that now is the most challenging time because of the dominance of the internet, what Echo called the empire of the imbeciles, and all that means for the discourse, the formation, exchange, and dissemination of ideas. So I think we're in a very bad place, and you see that with the woke agenda and the way the woke agenda challenges all of the collective wisdom that I described, all of the traditions, the habits, the customs, the culture that's essential to build a society that works. So I think we're in a very challenging place. The opportunity is this, however, because the case has never been made, or at least rarely been made. Roger Scruton is, of course, a a noble exception, and I shall speak more about him in turn as we go into question and answer. Roger described, by the way, drawing on Hegel, described our culture as a magnifying force, and it's a unifying force too. He said it was manifest in all the customs, beliefs, and practices of a people. And Roger, in his life and what he wrote, embodied that ideal. But with those notable exceptions, because it's been rarely made, it's a kind of blank sheet of paper. It's there to be made. And the opportunity is, I think, enhanced, one might say exaggerated, by the new political dynamic, the changing political demography. If you look at the 2019 election, the Conservative Party garnered the support of all kinds of people. I call them the silent majority, who were sick and tired of a set of bourgeois liberals dictating to them what they ought to believe. And they were desperate for an alternative and looked to the Conservative Party to provide that. Now, that's a huge opportunity for us because those people have high expectations. And if we meet them, we will not only get their support again, we will cement their support. You know, it's often said they've lent their vote to us. I think it's slightly more significant than that, because once people have made that change, it's hard for them to change back, hard for them personally to change back. But nonetheless, we shouldn't take it for granted. And if we can cement that support, I think we can make further gains amongst that part of the electorate, capture further seats, particularly in the Midlands and in the north of England. We just missed out on this time. So the political demography has changed, and therefore the constituency of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom has changed. The kind of people who vote Conservative is altering, changing, and that provides a fresh opportunity to make a case for cultural, social, and aesthetic conservatism of the kind that Roger Scruton did so elegantly and eloquently, that I've tried to do altogether more imperfectly in these brief words of introduction. Thank you.
So John, thank you so much. Thank you so much for also all the incredible work you do in Parliament. It feels very often that you are a lone voice fighting for our country and the spirit of our country. I wanted to follow up with you on Sir Roger's idea, and you talked a little bit about Oakeshot's sentimentality, and I wanted to ask you about the importance of Sir Roger's romanticism in his work, and actually how this strangely has an appeal to people across the country. Do you feel that this idea has certainly helped the Conservative Party through its recent changes and garner, an unprecedented level of support in 2019?
Well, of course, Roger Scruton was a professor of aesthetics, and I worked with him. I knew him for a long time, but I worked with him most recently and most particularly on the Better Building Beautiful Commission, to which I was the parliamentary advisor. And I saw him very effectively chairing that advisory body. So he was an aesthete. And you're right about the romanticism of Toryism. This is something that Disraeli understood better than any other Conservative leader. So there is a romanticism to Toryism, because if you believe, as I described it, in the debt we owe to the past, then you have to have a profound understanding of the past, and you have, and there is a glamour in that. There is a glamour in that understanding, and a beauty in it too. And if you believe in your debt to the future, you owe the future a duty. You owe the past for what they gave you, and you owe to the future a responsibility, a duty. Then again, you have to have a sense of romance about that, because for all of the reasons I gave earlier, the gentleness that's a part of that, the deeply romantic idea. And Disraeli understood that. And of course, and Disraeli articulated that romanticism in a very particular kind of way. He saw a social fusion, actually, between the working people and and the ruling class, which was largely drawn from a combination of the gentry and the aristocracy at that time, and that of itself is a romantic idea. But perhaps the most romantic idea of all is the idea of monarchy. So monarchy, if you were talking about the role the monarch plays in our constitution, for example, if you try to explain that or justify it on purely rational grounds, on mechanistic grounds, you'd probably fail. So there has to be something of magic about politics, by the way, and the monarchy has to have a magic about it, has to have a magical quality, almost a mystical quality. And the other thing I'd say about that is that the other reason for the romanticism of conservatism, leaving aside the reverence for the past, is that if you see society as something that's organic, growing in the way I described, then that's closely tied to the world that God created, the natural world God created. And so the aesthetic appreciation and the romantic understanding of that aesthetic is closely tied to that sense that society is an organic structure. It's very good that David Cameron, by the way, replaced the torch with a tree. It's absolutely right that the oak tree should be the symbol of conservatism. There couldn't be a better symbol. The socialism and fascism are mechanistic ideas, and liberalism isn't mechanistic. It is, to be fair to liberals, it isn't mechanistic in the way that the other two are, but it's not quite a disposition. It's not quite a sentiment in the way that conservatism is. Because if you think of liberalism in its most extreme incarnation, so in the work of Rand, say, there is something arid about it, something fundamentally unromantic about it, which is a stark contrast to the work of Scruton and Oakeshott, and of course, and Disraeli, as I described, but fundamentally Burke, who's the philosophical father of conservatism.
Thank you. I'm going to take some questions from our audience. Your opposition to globalist free trade is rather unique amongst conservatives. Should we look to mimic Japan's policy and restore factories from abroad to provide jobs to British workers? And this comes from Jacob Barden.
Well, I'm the last. I mean, maybe I'm the last Tory protectionist, but don't forget that protection, the debate about free trade and protection, which had its first incarnation really in the party, in terms of the party dispute around the Corn Laws and the difference between Wellington and Disraeli at that point and Peel, and then was reprised in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, particularly by Joe Chamberlain, although never a member of the party, of course, became a Tory and became a member of our government, and a very great man, by the way, Joe Chamberlain, one of my political heroes. So it wasn't always the case that this was seen as an open and shut case. So right up until 100 years ago, and a bit less than that, there was a lively debate in the Tory party about this. There was the vestiges of that still that lingered on after the war. People like Julian Amory and a few others. And Edward Lee, I think, my colleague in the House, would probably share a similar view to me about that, and possibly Andrew Rossendale, and there will be a few other conservatives who might take a view about globalism that I would take. I think there's almost two things here. There's the issue of protecting British jobs and industries, and then there's a separate issue of globalism. They are linked, but they're not quite the same. So the reason that globalism is such a thorny issue is because for many of the people I described that voted for us in 2019, globalism hasn't delivered a great deal, has it? Globalism has favoured the wealthy, but it hasn't always cut the mustard for the working man. And so I think of course, the Republicans in America took great electoral advantage of that in Trump's original election victory. America saw what globalism had done for some of the Rust Belt states, for example, was anything but improve their circumstances. So I think globalism, there's a debate to be had about globalism and whether it's a net good or bad. For me, that debate being drawn into sharp focus by the large monopoly capitalist businesses like Google and Amazon and so on, and they represent a very ugly aspect of capitalism, don't they? Because they are detached from locality, they are fairly careless about their business practices, they are of such a scale that they're entirely unknowable. So there's no intimacy associated with buying or selling from Amazon in the way there might be from the village shop or the local supplier. And they're unaccountable. They wield a huge power, economic power, which is wholly unaccountable. So I think there are big questions to be asked about monopoly capitalism and about how that can be controlled. And so for me, a free economy only works when the multiplicity of people that sell and a multiplicity of people who can buy from them. And the dynamism that comes from a free economy is really all about people being able to enter the market and make a difference. Once the market becomes the captive of a handful of huge suppliers, the consumer suffers, and actually capitalism is an altogether less appealing thing. So I think there will be a debate about this, and there's already a debate happening about how we regulate and control some of those very large, very powerful and wholly unaccountable businesses. And I think that's going to tip the balance of the argument back in favour of global skeptics like me. The second issue is about trade. Now, that, and again, brought into sharp focus by recent events. So when the COVID crisis struck, and we suddenly found that we buy half of our medicines and health-related products from India, and that we buy very large numbers of other vital consumable products from abroad, a vulnerability was exposed, a fragility to our economic circumstances and our social circumstances, by the way. And therefore, the whole idea of onshoring was given a new lease of life, that we should be doing many of these things locally, merely on the grounds of security, food security, health security, other kinds of national interest. So I think there's a debate to be had there as well. Shouldn't we be supplying all our vital needs in as much as we can do in a way that allows us to secure that supply, particularly in challenging circumstances of the kind the pandemic gave rise? There's also a third argument, and that's about the length of supply chains. So when you shorten supply chains, you do all kinds of good things. You change the relationship between the supplier of good and the consumer of it. I mentioned village shops as an example of this. If you can go to buy your foodstuffs from a local retailer and he bought his goods or she bought hers from a local supplier, all the issues about traceability become more straightforward. You know exactly what you're eating, where it was made, how it was made, and by whom. And suddenly you have an intimacy, a kind of economic intimacy. And in the end, consumption, the business of buying goods, is not an entirely soulless affair. It's not entirely utilitarian. When you buy from someone in your locality who you know, the chances are they'll reinvest the money you pay them back into the local economy, therefore making it more sustainable. The chances are they'll care about what they sell to you, the good or service they give you, because of that local intimacy, because they know that you know them, and you know people they know, and they know people you know. So there's a kind of sense in which there's a mutual assurance about that commercial relationship. And you do all kinds of other things, don't you? You talk about the weather, about the test match, about what's happening on the street in which they live, about what and what should happen in the locale. So this is a socially sustaining exercise, and economic activity in that sense is deeply social and cultural. But it isn't when it's made anonymous in the way that the big corporations I described earlier choose to make it, and they want to make it, their whole business model is built around that anonymity, that disconnect between the consumer and the producer. So I think we can build what I call a fraternal economics, an economics which of course delivers practical results. It delivers utility, but also does all kinds of other good things along the way. And that fraternal economics can be closely allied to all the other things I described when I spoke about Scruton and conservatism.
I'm going to take a question from Jake Scott, who is editor at the Mallard. Jake says, I've personally found Scruton's commitment to Kantianism to undermine his organicism that could be strengthened by embracing Hegelianism properly. Do you think conservatives are more naturally Kantian or Hegelian?
Hegelian. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Hegel. And by the way, some of the things I've just said about the economy are very Hegelian. Hegel was a great advocate, as you probably know, of craft skills, and I am too. By the way, I was the minister responsible for skills, but I also am chairman of the all-party craft skills group. So Hegel was a great champion of practical learning and apprenticeships, and the Germans have got a long history of involvement in apprenticeships. Hegel believed in his words, the socialization of the inanimate. And that ties closely to what I said about goods and services, the way you socialize otherwise utilitarian and functional things. So I am Hegelian. And actually Scruton was pretty Hegelian too. I share the question's view about the contrast in Kant and Hegel. I'm Hegelian. And I've had that debate. I know that William, my son, played a key role in being the hors d'oeuvre before the main course for this evening's supper. And Will and I have an ongoing debate about Hegel. He's less keen on Hegel than I am, but I know that Scruton was essentially a Hegelian, though I take the point about Kant. Scruton was more, I had this conversation with him, by the way. Scruton was more liberal than me, but then who isn't?
I'm going to wrap two anonymous questions into one. These two questions focus more about the sort of balance within the Conservative Party between its more liberal instincts and its more conservative instincts, social conservative instincts. For you, you've seen quite a few leaders now. You were elected in 1997, and you've seen the party's leadership change over a number of leaders. For you, where the party stands now, do you feel that it has got the right balance now, whereby it can become a truly popular and socially conservative party going forward with its economic agenda, with its current messaging to the electorate? Or do you think that at the top it will revert back to its more liberal instincts?
I think there's two aspects to that, okay? So there's the electoral aspect, the political aspect. So if we're going to embrace the new Tory voters that I mentioned at the beginning, and we're going to recognise that the seats we won that we've never won before, we need to secure by making those people believe, and truly believe, that we share their values. Because politics is increasingly a values-based subject. The idea that the reductionist view of politics, that it can be reduced to the official management of the public purse, the kind of effective organisation of the economy, is just not good enough now. It's increasingly a values-based discourse. If we're going to do that, if we're going to cement that relationship, then we may have to face up to the fact that means losing votes from another type of voter, and that other type of voter would typically be the privileged liberals. Okay, now not that many privileged liberals vote Tory, but some do, and we may have to abandon them, and that might have direct consequences, particularly constituencies, by the way. So I'm not sure it's possible to put together a program, a policy program, a strategy that allows you to continue to hold Bolsover and Blythe Valley and Bassetlaw, and simultaneously to take back Richmond-on-Thames. I don't know if you can. I don't think that can be done. And if there were a choice to be made, I stick with Blythe and Bolsover and Bassetlaw, and leave Richmond and Thames to the Liberals. It's a horrible thing to say about anyone, to leave them with the Liberal Party, but nonetheless, horrible fate. But I kind of think if that was the choice. Now there will be people who think that that's not a choice. That triangulation has a huge superficial appeal, and it worked for Blair, and it worked for Cameron. So electorally, for Blair over a long period of time, beginning in '97, you mentioned, and then for David Cameron in 2010, triangulation worked. The idea that you could build this big tent, you could capture a huge number of votes in the centre and marginalise people on the left, and the people on the right would have no option but to vote for you anyway, because although they did have some options in terms of UKIP and stuff, but nonetheless, it sort of worked. But I don't think we're in that world anymore. I think triangulation is the issue now. I think it's about recognising there is a huge gap between the presumptions of the bourgeois liberals and the presumptions of a group that I call the silent majority of hard-working patriots who both reject and resent the bourgeois liberals' preoccupations. So I think that's the political issue. To the question, to go back to the questioner, his question is really, has the party woken up to that yet? And are they prepared to come to swallow that pill, to recognise you can't do both? I don't know is the answer. I don't know if the party has woken up to that. But I know that Boris Johnson is highly pragmatic and realistic. And I'm pretty sure that those around him that will advise him on the sophology of this will tell him that the sophology demands a recognition of the political demographics that I've set out. The second part of the question is, have we developed both a persuasive and coherent narrative and a set of policies which match it? And the answer is it's work in progress, isn't it? Because COVID, in a sense, filled so much space, there wasn't really much opportunity post the election to begin to take the manifesto and look at what that meant in practice. And so I think it's work in progress. There are promising signs, but they're not all promising. So I had to fight a battle recently to make sure that the government didn't introduce a bill which eliminated the word woman and mother from legislation. I led that campaign, as you know, and we ultimately won it through friends and colleagues in the House of Lords. And that was a kind of worrying sign. But one or two good signs. I mean, we've got some good. We've got support for our work on legislation to greatly increase the sentences for people that damage war memorials, and in a way that the kind of climate, was it the climate thugs? The thugs, but one group of thugs, I don't know which of them, attacked the cenotaph, didn't they? Might as well, but they both attacked it in different ways, didn't they? On different days. But so those people can be kind of punished, and other good work. I had a very good response from Robert Emery to my campaign that road names should be named after English heroes, and we're getting good support from Oliver Dowden and the line we've taken on some of the organisations that had adopted, that are supposed to look after our heritage, but have adopted work practices. So there are some good signs. We've got good rising stars like Kemi Badenoch and Suella Fernandez, Braverman now, with apologies to Raoul Braverman, who I know very well actually. So there are some good people like them that are in the junior reaches of government that I hope will go far. So the answer is, I don't know, but I remain hopeful. And the reason I formed the Common Sense Group is to make sure that the party knows there's a substantial group of members of parliament, disproportionately amongst our membership, by the way, are 2019 intake MPs, who both know what the electoral consequences of getting this right are, but also believe that we have a responsibility to articulate the hopes and fears of that silent majority.
I want to follow up with a hybrid question from Hilary Martin, but I'm going to twist it slightly, which is about how we should view our history. One of the key cultural battles that we are undergoing today across our society is how to reconcile our beliefs about British history with the political demands of today. And you yourself are a former history teacher. How do we view British history objectively and in a way that we can take great pride in our achievements and at the same time do the careful analysis that helps us look at decisions and areas where we've gone wrong?
Well, I could challenge, I mean, if I was going to be devil's advocate, I could challenge your premise that we need to be objective. I mean, I'm quite in favour of subjectivity, really. I don't know why we have to be. I mean, I always say about these things that people make cases against prejudice and subjectivity, but love, which is the greatest human emotion, sentiment, is both prejudice and subjective, isn't it? We're deeply prejudiced in favour of the people we love, and we're highly subjective about our assessment of them. And the things we love. So I could challenge your point about objectivity, but let's not do that. Let's assume your point is acceptable. I think it's a recognition then of two things above all else. Firstly, that history is a litany of good and bad and ugly things. So lovely things and horrible things, but you can neither dissect it nor desiccate it. So you can't break up into tiny bits and pick those bits that you like, and you can't go through the process of carving it up either and building something new that didn't really happen. So you can't. So history, you have to take history as a whole, and what we are today is a product of the whole. That whole. So where we are now is a product of all that came before us, good, bad, and ugly. And in a sense, in understanding what we are now, you have to recognize some of the things that we wouldn't necessarily approve of, but were essential on the journey to the destination, which is the present. So a good example would be if you think about the process by which the Church of England was formed, the Reformation. The Reformation was, as you know, led to years of all kinds of horrors, with obviously Bloody Mary persecuting Protestants, and then Edward VI persecuting Catholics, and all that meant, leaving aside the dissolution of the monasteries, which of course itself was extraordinarily brutal and horrible thing. But had that not all happened, had that journey not taken place, we wouldn't be where we are now. And to try to go back and to, as I said, break that up into pieces or carve it up in a way that allows us to rebuild it is not to understand that the journey of history brings you to the destination we're at. The other thing that the second thing, I said there were two things. The second thing is, so the recognition that what we are now is a product of all that's been before. The second thing is not to exaggerate or distort particular bits of history. So, for example, we have this almost fetishistic interest in slavery, and a very crass assumption, by the way, that slavery is all about the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the truth is that slavery has been a horrible feature of the human condition, really ever since humans began. And when we judge the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans, we don't judge them only on the basis that they were civilizations which actually, where slavery was endured. We don't write off the whole of Roman civilization on that basis. Of course, we don't approve of the slavery that took place in Rome or Greece, or endorse it, but we don't only see those civilizations through that prism. And so it's dangerous to exaggerate aspects of history rather than seeing it holistically. And the further distortion of that particular argument, of course, is not to recognize that Britain was the country that abolished the slave trade due to the great work of William Wilberforce, who, another political hero of mine, by the way, portrait, I've had his portrait on my wall at Westminster, a 30-year campaign, and then enforced the ban on the slave trade through the power of the Royal Navy, which cost the British, rightly so. I mean, it was an expensive and noble cause for decades. But you never know that from the jaundiced view that's presented of Britain's role in that saga. So we must neither exaggerate aspects of history nor distort them, and know the whole of history makes us what we are. So that's how I see it. And in the round, as a whole, I'm immensely proud of Britain's contribution to the world. I think we've been a hugely important force for good in the world. So that's how I see history. But detached from history, we are impoverished. You can't separate now what is from what's been.
You very interestingly mentioned love, and you talked about William Wilberforce, and this ties in very much with the Christian aspect of British culture and history that seems to easily be forgotten nowadays. Would you like to see certain aspects of Christianity or certain themes within it come back into public life in a way that can benefit people, not just the majority of British citizens who are Christians, but also all its citizens as well? Because it seems that it actually has a lot of benefits to our society in terms of providing social values and common themes that we can take forward together as one united kingdom.
There's reflecting on some of the philosophical points that were made earlier by your questioners and so on. The reason that Christian faith is important, and particularly important to conservatism, leaving aside it's the fact that it's true, but let's put that to one side for a moment, that Jesus was indeed the Son of God, is because in the Christian understanding of man, we recognize that we fell from the state of grace, so we accept our imperfection. Now, this is the fundamental difference between liberalism and conservatism, by the way. The conservatives, because we accept the idea of the fall from the state of grace, believe that man is fundamentally imperfect, a sinner in Christian terms, and that therefore the best we can hope for, I hinted at this earlier, is to mitigate the inevitable imperfections associated with that fall from the state of grace. So we can't build heaven on earth. We can't create from a blueprint a perfect society. We can muddle along and make the best of what we are and the best of what we've got. And because the conservatives get that, understand that, they always have a measured view of the difference that we can make, and they're protected from the extreme, if you like, of those who feel that if only we followed these strict rules, we could indeed make earth heavenly. So you can't really detach conservatism from that acceptance of the fall, and that's why you could trace conservatism back through Aquinas and so on to a distinctly Christian understanding of man. And you get this in more recent times with T.S. Eliot, for example, and and G.K. Chesterton, who were both social conservatives and obviously Christians, and have written about Christian society and what that looks like. So now you asked, that's the philosophical answer. You asked the practical answer is should conservatives recognise that? Well, I think people are always suspicious of a politics which is in our system, at least, which is explicitly religious. So people have a view that religion and politics ought to be separated, that they are different aspects of human life, of our personal lives and our communal lives. So I don't think you could make a direct association, but of that kind. But I do think it'd be better if more people understood the roots of Toryism being based on that Christian understanding. And moreover, I'd be even more assertive than that, and so talk about gauging the significance of articulating a case for Western civilization, which is Judeo-Christian civilization. Western civilization is now under attack. It won't be very long, by the way, before the woke lobby actually say that openly. The next target will be to try to besmirch the idea of Western civilization. That somehow this is something to be ashamed of rather than something to be proud of. And Western civilization is essentially a Judeo-Christian civilization. And we should be immensely proud of that. And so I think we can be assertive about that without being exclusive about the relationship between being a conservative and being a Christian.
I'm going to rephrase William Yarwood's question to you, which is effectively about this issue with gradualism. He quotes Michael Malice, who says that conservatism is progressivism with a driving speed limit. How should conservatives affect change in this Burkean idea of gradualism, which you've alluded to a bit before in your earlier comments, while at the same time dealing with the ideological problem that Sir Roger Scruton picked up on, which is that the Conservatives' natural instinct is to say, well, if we had a slogan, it would be hesitate. So this balance between putting forward change, but at the same time preserving the things that we love.
The key thing is to reject the Whig theory of history. So it's not just liberals that are wrong, it's Whigs too, by the way. I mean, Dr. Johnson, who was a great Tory, of course, said that the devil was the first Whig. And so the Whig view of history is that progress is inevitable, so that all change is likely to lead to progress, and there's an inevitable progression, the phrase that was used. I'm not sure I even believe in the idea of progress as a concept. I'm not very interested in it as an intellectual construct, and I'm not even sure I believe in it, but let's put that again to one side. I think once you accept that there is an inevitable and predetermined course of history, and then you accept that even if there were, it wouldn't all be changed for the better. So there isn't this so you reject the idea of progress in that sense. You have to move to recognize that at any point in time, some things are getting worse and some things are getting better simultaneously. So if I think of my lifetime, in my lifetime, some things have got palpably worse, and simultaneously other things got palpably better. So I'll give you examples. Something that's got palpably better in my lifetime is the way that we regard disabled people. So I can remember as a child, and certainly my parents will be able to remember before me, disability and disabled people regarded in an altogether less agreeable way. So it was either a cause of a kind of slightly an insulting pity, or at best, or a complete ignorance, or worse. So people were either hidden away, or we felt sort of insultingly pitiful about them. Disabled people now are recognised as, valuable and functioning Britons, like any other valuable and functioning Britons, that have an immense contribution to make to life. Disabled sport's been important in that, by the way. And I think as disabled sport has exposed people who are not disabled to all that can be done by, for example, amputees or people that are in wheelchairs with profound spine injury, or people with learning difficulties, that's changed perceptions. So I think the perception of disability has changed for the better in my lifetime. There's still more work to do on that, but it's been a positive thing. But if you think about the civilities and courtesies that my parents would have taken for granted in terms of their social interactions, I think they have been eroded at a frightening pace. So I think we live in a much ruder, more brutal, less kind society in that way. So we're kinder in the way we perceive disability, although I don't quite like to describe it as kindness, because that sounds of itself quite patronizing, actually. But we're far less kind in the way that we deal with people we don't know, and we become less courteous. And actually, even people we do know, we've become less courteous and less civil. So those are two changes that happened in my lifetime. I picked them at random, and they've happened simultaneously. And societies are like that all the time. Things are getting worse and getting better all the time. It's a constant state of flux in any society at any period in history. Once you accept that, then you can see those changes for themselves, and you can you can exercise judgment about them. So we can judge the things that are getting worse. We need to try to stop getting worse, the things that are worth saving, we should fight to save. But where there's a need to reform, I talked about Wilberforce earlier. Wilberforce was essentially a Tory. I know that the Conservative Party didn't exist then. He was a friend of Pitt, and there's no doubt where Wilberforce stood on the issues that, of the day, but recognised that the horror of the slave trade needed to be addressed and dedicated a good part of his parliamentary life, not all of it, he did other things too, actually, by the way, to doing it. Lord Shaftesbury would be another Tory social reformer who saw, I mean, people talk about the Factory Acts and the work Shaftesbury did reforming the factories, which is a wonderful thing that he did, and of course the Ragged School movement, which he also was the architect of, the inspiration for. But actually the first thing that Shaftesbury did was to go into the asylums. And when it was regarded as extraordinary, anyone should want to take up the cause of the insane. And Shaftesbury did that and made a huge difference by his work. So he was a Tory social reformer. He's a deep constitutional Tory, by the way, who resisted a lot of constitutional change. So I think conservatism doesn't resist all change. It just believes not all change is for the better.
You mentioned there things that might need to be saved, and this actually ties slightly in with an anonymous question which asks, what really should be done about the opposition? Should they simply be left to wallow in the current situation where they sit, or is there a sort of need for a strong opposition party to better Conservatives, to remind Conservatives?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think the opposition that we face now is largely extra parliamentary. So the Labour Party is going through one of its many periods of catharsis, isn't it? So this is the post-Corbyn catharsis, where Starmer's trying to make it credible again. I know Keir Starmer, actually, by the way. He shadowed me when I was the security minister, and I like him. I get on well with him personally. I mean, clearly we don't agree about a lot of things, but we do agree about some things, and I find him personally agreeable. And he's thoughtful man. I think a decent, thoughtful man would be my judgment, as much as I could exercise one. But he's got an incredible task, hasn't he? Because he's got to try and make the party credible, knowing that most of its membership is not, well, I would say most, but many of its members are not particularly credible, and their view of the world is not the view of the world that's shared by a significant proportion of the electorate, including a large number of people who formerly voted Labour. So that dichotomy seems to me to be almost impossible to turn into a formula that would be sufficient to win an election. So I think Starmer's got a huge problem. But the forces outside of Parliament are rampant and hostile to all we believe. So I've spoken about it previously in this evening and many times publicly. The kind of woke army people that are few in South Holland, the Deepings, or in the seats I mentioned earlier, the one in the 19 election, but many in the media, in social media, in universities, in a lot of the places where influence is vested, are the enemy within, aren't they? The enemy within our society. They need to be resisted and fought at every single turn. So I think most of our battles will be fought against people beyond Parliament. Now, we'll use Parliament as a vehicle to fight those battles, and government as an instrument to both hold the line and advance. It's not just enough to hold the line. For example, with the work I've been doing against some of the organisations that have tried to rewrite our history, I've recently launched a campaign to ensure that we commemorate and honour all of the winners, the Victoria Cross and the George Cross. I'd like to see many more statues of great English heroes in every part of the country, in villages and towns, blue plaques, road names, all kinds of things after great English heroes. That's the front foot campaign. You mustn't always be holding the line and trying to prevent change. Sometimes you need to move forward and be on the offensive. So we will fight those battles from Parliament, but they won't be largely battles in Parliament, where I think Labour remains weak and likely to struggle. over the coming years. It may be that Keir Starmer was a sort of John Smith figure for Labour. You know, John Smith, of course, became leader after the Labour lurched to the left last time round with Michael Foot. And it took John Smith's leadership and arguably Neil Kinnock's too, before Blair came in and Labour was credible again. And Labour may be history may be repeating itself, and the Labour may be going through the same catharsis now. It may be a long time before they are fit to govern again. But there was another aspect of the question. I'm sorry to be so long in my answer. The other aspect of the question: do governments need good oppositions? And the answer to that is ideally yes. You know, as a government minister, the work was done by shadow ministers. I mentioned Keir Starmer there, was really important because many times when I was a minister, I would be taking a bill through committee. I did a lot of different jobs in the government. I took a lot of bills through. And the shadow minister would make an argument in committee when we were scrutinising a piece of legislation. And I would go back to my department and say to my civil servants, I think he was right about that. He made a perfectly good argument. Why aren't we doing that? Why haven't we thought of that? Or why don't we change the bill to reflect that? So the legislative process in particular requires not only high quality people to hold the government to account, but also a productive and professional relationship between those who govern and those who oppose them. That became impossible under Corbyn because the relations between the parties were so fractured, and also because of his own incompetence, really. But it is ideal that dynamic, that interface between government and opposition should be sufficiently challenging to those who exercise power to get better outcomes in terms of good governance.
This slightly ties into a question from Jacob, which is, Gramsci spoke about a long march through the institutions, and he asks whether there should be a sort of similar conservative push to get more conservative appointments in key positions which have cultural influence, whether it's at the BBC or in various posts, such as the post that Sir Roger took up with the Building Commission, I believe. So do you feel there's a need to push more Conservatives into these key bureaucratic appointments in order to bring about the kind of long-term institutional change that actually, funnily enough, New Labour was able to implement quite effectively?
The short answer is yes, really. I mean, I don't want to elaborate too much, except to say that people on this call that think they can play a part should write to me, and I will forward their names to the Cabinet Office. And we'll see if we can get somebody appointed. So there's an offer. That's a bonus there. Yeah, I think the institutions that you describe are packed with all kinds of people that, if I had a daughter, I wouldn't want them to marry.
An interesting one. Question from the president of Newcastle University Conservative Association. How do traditionalist right-wing Conservatives put their points across more effectively in the media in order to espouse our beliefs? You're a very, very eloquent speaker when you speak in Parliament and when you've appeared on various interviews. How do we better communicate our beliefs and values?
Everyone on this call, and this is a challenge, by the way, so I made you an offer, write to me and tell me what you want to do in some non-departmental public body. I have no power to, by the way, I have no executive power in that respect, but I'm happy to support any good people that put their name forward. Now, here's the challenge. The challenge is every one of you should be regularly writing to local and regional papers, and it's surprisingly easy to get printed in many local regional papers because they don't have the same volume of letters sent to them, so they're actually desperate to fill space. You should be calling up local radio stations and national radio stations. So every time any questions on Radio 4 appears and someone vaguely sensible or sounds on the panel, ring any answers and make sure we blitz any answers with calls from people who will support that sound performer. We're really quite poor at this by and large, but it doesn't take many people to make a difference. And the left are much better at organising it. So don't be fearful about putting yourself forward. I started writing to local papers when I was 15 and started campaigning in the area I lived in that kind of way. So, got on local telly and radio many times when I was a student in Nottingham and so on and so forth. So you can actually make a difference, but you have to be prepared to get down and get dirty. You have to be prepared to do that graft. I'll leave aside social media, but there's of course a parallel with all of that. We've allowed Twitter to become dominated by largely left-wing elements. People always say about this, by the way, that's partly because conservatives are too busy living normal lives, because they are less abnormal, they're less prepared to do this stuff. But it doesn't take that long, actually. So you can have a perfectly agreeable normal life and do this. There's not an either or. And so we just need to be much more active. And I think with 500 people could completely change the landscape using the techniques I've described, both in modern media and traditional media. 500 out of a country of 60 odd million. I do believe that, by the way. So get out there and do it. And if anyone on this, what do you call one of these things? Is this a webinar or
this is a webinar, Zoom?
Oh, is it? How exciting! Right, very good. So I've never been on social media. I mean, I regard it as very vulgar, but I just want you to know that you should be on it, because somebody's got to be there. While it's there, we've got to be there, haven't we? So I think we need to. So my challenge is, everyone's on this webinar. You should do one of those things. You should make a phone call. You should write a letter. You should get on a. I know many of you do. I'm sure many of you do, but just do it more. Do it daily, weekly. Do it once a week for the next 4 weeks, next month. And if you don't, I'll be bitterly disappointed, and I shall find out where you live.
That ties in with your role on the Intelligence Committee. So just quickly before we head out, I want to ask you quickly about recommended reading. But before I do, just for our audience tonight, there's big concern because of the growing power and influence of China and Russia and their very, very troublesome tactics in terms of intelligence gathering, theft of intellectual property, and other security threats that we face. And also at the same time, we have the domestic terrorist threat from both white supremacists and also Islamic jihadists. How can we better deal with these threats? And is the UK capable of holding its own against these growing dangers? Okay,
so my role in the Intelligence and Security Committee, which you kindly referred to, prohibits me from saying too much, and my role as former security minister similarly. But I do speak on security a lot in the House for those reasons. And what I said is this: that when I was security minister, my summation of what you've described would be that I learned then the threats we face are probably even worse than you imagine, and that the means we have of dealing with them, our security and intelligence services, are probably even better than you imagine them, probably even more effective than you imagine them. So we have superb intelligence and security services, amongst the very best in the world. I don't want to kind of create a pecking order, but certainly amongst the very best in the world. And I work with the Five Eyes community, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, America, is critically important for our security, and it is of the highest order and quality. But the threat we face is profound. The vast bulk of the subjects of interest are Islamist fanatics. You're right about other possible sources of terror, and indeed the Intelligence and Security Committee is currently doing a piece of work on right-wing terrorism. In terms of hostile state actors, as they're known in the trade, you're right too about Russia and China. The challenge for the security services in those terms is we know a lot about Russia because we've been dealing with Russia for a very long time in security terms. So back to the days of the Cold War, we're very good at understanding the character of Russian activity in this sphere and how to counter it. I'm not suggesting we always get it right, and of course there are examples where we haven't managed to get it right. You know, the poisoning in in this country being a good example. But we are learning more and more about how to counter China. The problem with countering China, without giving anything away, I think, is the scale of their work. The scale of Chinese activity in security terms is so immense. They hoover up immense amounts of data every day. Now, the truth of it is almost all of it is valueless. They're looking for a needle in a haystack, but they're prepared to collect a lot of haystacks to find the needles. And so countering that at scale is very, very difficult indeed. Again, the Security Committee are looking at China at the moment, and we're in the middle of a very significant, very substantial piece of work on that. So again, I don't want to say too much about that. The only thing I will say, which has been in the public domain, is that we do really have to be very careful about Chinese investment here and its purpose. So Chinese investment here and the Chinese engagement with us, where there's financial advantage to us from that engagement, should never be seen as primarily or philanthropic on the Chinese part, if it's ever philanthropic at all, which is highly debatable.
It sounds too good to be true. It probably is, as the old cliche. So John, you've been so generous with your time, and I'm really honoured to have been able to host you and listen to your fantastic answers, go into so many things about various thinkers, and you talked about Aquinas, Shaftesbury and Oakeshott and others. So perhaps we could extend an invitation for the future. And before you leave us, please would you share with our audience, first of all, a great history book which you read or that you would recommend for our audience, and then a great work of conservatism or a conservative writer who we can practically get into that kind of key scriptural engagement with?
Okay, that's a good question. So in terms of historians, William is very keen on Hugh Trevor Roper and so on. But I've got a soft spot for Arthur Bryant, now a bit neglected and probably regarded very poorly by the kind of the left-wing academic establishment. But Arthur Bryant was the person who spoke about our Ireland story, and I'd recommend Arthur Bryant for any patriot who wants to read history. Thinkers, I mentioned T.S. Eliot. Eliot was probably the primary, the leading into the 20th century intellectual, Tory intellectual, hugely important as a poet, of course, pivotally important as a poet. But actually, his prose is well worth reading, and I think, he's pretty heavy going. Having said that, but very well worth reading. So I'd recommend T.S. Eliot. And then, if I was to give every aspirant Tory MP one book to read, I'd give them Scruton's England and Elegy. I think if you read England and Elegy, which is biographical in part, it's autobiographical in part, you understand everything about England and everything about Scruton, and a good deal about conservatism and why it matters so much. So that's the book I'd recommend. For a novel, by the way, I would certainly recommend, because it's not all about politics, I'd recommend, if for those who haven't read it, everyone must read Middlemarch by George Eliot. George Eliot, again, disliked by the left pretty roundly, but the greatest 19th century novelist, greater than Dickens, greater than Thackeray. The greatest 19th century novelist, George Eliot. So Middlemarch, England and Elegy, and Arthur Bryant. I think the book is called Our Ireland Story, isn't it? If it isn't, it's something similar.
So John, thank you so much. We wish you the best in Parliament and in taking forward conservatism. Thank you for speaking on the character of conservatism to our audience, and thank you to our audience. Thank you to William, who stepped in